All right, good afternoon, and thanks everyone for coming to this afternoon's COMtalk Beyond Facts and Figures. So, my name is Eric Gordon. I'm a professor in the journalism department at Boston University's College of Communication and also the director of the new Center for Media Innovation and Social Impact, or MISI. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion, Beyond Facts and Figures, Reimagining Trustworthy Communication in a Time of Institutional Crisis. So today's event is part of a series of our virtual events we call COMtalks, featuring topics and experts in advertising, film, journalism, media science, public relations, and television. Our conversation today will be recorded and available to watch later on Com's YouTube channel. So let's dive into today's topic. Trust in American democratic institutions has fallen to record lows. Fact-based government communication has become a relic. Political identities have become hardened by algorithms, and news organizations are struggling to connect to deeply divided publics. Communication that supports a functional democracy feels dangerously out of reach. So we need to think big. We need to reimagine a communication ecosystem that supports just and democratic futures. So a quick word about MISI. Founded in 2025, we are an applied research center dedicated to advancing information integrity and strengthening trust in democratic institutions. We support scholars and practitioners from diverse disciplines as they ask foundational questions about local media ecosystems and explore novel uses of media and technology to bridge social divides. We are well positioned to lead this charge from where we sit at Boston University's College of Communication. There's a lot of communications talent and specialized knowledge within the college, and there is a growing appetite for departments and faculty to converge around wicked problems. We have the opportunity and the responsibility to cultivate a deeper understanding of public communication at a time of deep social divisions, starting right here in the Boston area. I mentioned that we are an applied research center. That means we work alongside practitioners to shape ideas and to put them into practice. One way we're doing this is through our fellowship program, which is generously funded by the Mellon Foundation. This year, the theme of our fellowship is climate communication. Just last week, we welcomed our inaugural class of 15 fellows who include a range of faculty across the social sciences and humanities at BU, as well as artists, advocates, and leaders in the climate and environment space around and across New England. This illustrious group of storytellers and scholars will be working this year to understand how best to communicate in a varied and turbulent media ecosystem. But we're going to get that conversation started this afternoon with us. Today, I am joined by the three associate directors of MISI, all of whom are faculty in the College of Communication. And so bear with me as I introduce this esteemed group, and then I'm going to ask each of them questions to get us started. So David Abel is MISI's Director of Creative Works. He is a professor of the practice in the journalism department and an award-winning reporter and documentary filmmaker covering war, coups, terrorism, natural disasters, a pandemic, poverty, climate change, and much more. In 2014, David and his colleagues at the Boston Globe won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of the Boston Marathon bombings. His films have been broadcast on the Discovery Channel, PBS, BBC, BBC World News, and other major platforms, winning numerous awards. His most recent film, In the Whale, won the Audience Choice Award at the New Hampshire Film Festival and other awards. Amy Geller is MISI's Director of Impact. She is an assistant professor in the film and TV department and an award-winning creative producer and filmmaker whose 20-plus year career includes fiction and documentaries, broadcasts on PBS, BBC, Documentary Channel, Netflix, Apple TV, and many others. Geller served as the artistic director of the Boston Jewish Film Festival and was president of Women in Film and Video New England. She produced the widely seen For the Love of Movies, the story of American film criticism, and is the co-director of two acclaimed feature documentaries, The Guys Next Door and The Rabbi Goes West. And Chris Wells is MISI's Director of Research. He is a professor of journalism and emerging media studies, and he studies how news media coverage takes shape how citizens learn about politics, and how they choose to participate. His most recent work is exploring how people can understand the many different media around us as making up an interactive media system. Before earning his PhD at the University of Washington, Chris worked in environmental politics. So before we dive in, a word about our format. I plan to get the ball rolling with some questions, but soon members of our online audience will be able to pose their own questions for the panel. You can submit the questions at any time during our time together via the Q&A tab in Zoom, and we'll get to as many as we can. So let's get started. Chris, I have a question for you to get us going. We are in a moment defined by grievance politics, where groups lament that they aren't recognized by each other or an expert administrative state. This, of course, has reached the level of mainstream politics in the United States and elsewhere. You have written about the concepts of recognition and misrecognition. Can you explain what this means and how this might help us understand what's going on right now?
Yeah. Hello, everybody, and thanks, Eric. So I think the concept of recognition is a really interesting one in our particular moment. It's an old one in political philosophy. It actually goes back hundreds of years. People like Rousseau and Hegel wrote about recognition, but it keeps popping up at different times during history. And right now, I think it's got a really interesting intersection with our communication environment, with the attention economy. And so I think it's getting magnified and taken in new directions. So the idea of recognition itself is really simple. It's the idea that human beings have a need that's social. So it's not like it's like a physical need, like we talk about shelter and food and stuff like that. But humans also have this social need, which has to do with interacting with other people. And recognition is the idea that we can describe what happens when we see each other, not physically see each other, but to what degree do we recognize each other as full humans, as legitimate members of a political community, as citizens, and things like that. And so the recognition process for people begins early as kids. We have recognition within our household as a child if our needs are met and things like that. And then it expands as our awareness of the world expands. So you can imagine a kid feels recognized or not recognized if they're consistently not chosen for the kickball team or something like that. As we become adults, we become aware that there's a much wider world, a wide spectrum of people who might be recognizing us or not recognizing us. And furthermore, that it's not really just an individual matter, that I'm not just recognized as a person, but I'm recognized or misrecognized by virtue of my membership in groups to which society ascribes me or which I feel affiliated with. And so I think there's a lot of insight we can take from that and the fact that different societies have particular recognition dynamics in which some groups are recognized more than others, and there's a set of benefits that come with being recognized in this way, even though recognition itself is not necessarily directly tied to state power in a legal sense. It can still have a lot of significance. Importantly, recognition is conveyed with communication. It might be interpersonal communication, but in the wider society, there's a lot of media communication. News media represent particular groups in particular ways. And now we have social media in which groups can speak to one another as groups, as identities, which has obviously accelerated the process. There's also an interesting kind of inflection point in recognition politics, which gets to the grievance politics you just mentioned. So about 50 years ago, I think we saw a shift in the way that recognition was used and the role that it played in movements. The philosopher Wendy Brown really described this in her idea of wounded attachments. And she observed that as groups, especially groups following the civil rights movement, as they kind of narrated themselves into existence, as they developed a self-narrative, describing their own misrecognition at the hands of others, including at the hands of the state, became really important. And she observed that this was sometimes very important because groups needed to understand their history, but there was also a dysfunctional element to it in that some groups could become so wrapped up in telling the story of really their victimhood, was one of the words that she used, that they could lose sight of the potential of breaking beyond that victimhood. And to bring it up to today, I think we see this really powerfully and again magnified in social media, where lots of folks can participate in these kind of recognition struggles, making claims that one group is misrecognizing another claim. We have all of these ideas on social media about dunking and the ratio effect, and these often are tied up with really important identities that people are strongly tied to on one side or the other. So we've seen a magnification of that in social media, but in the broader media landscape too, as media have fragmented and media outlets, sometimes very small ones, have arisen to really serve very niche kind of identity interests. So I think we need to look out for some of the harms there. One of the things I think that goes on has to do with the algorithms, and that's the fact that a lot of this identity related and recognition related content generates a lot of engagement, and the algorithms figure that out pretty quickly and serve those up, and that magnifies the engagement. And then, of course, the folks creating the content figure that out and start shifting their content in that direction. But the other part is just participatory. The fact that everybody can participate in dunking or trying to create really engaging content, I think contributes to the strength of people's identities. You mentioned that too, Eric, that we seem to have these identities that just feel entrenched and it seems like we can't overcome them. And I think the communication environment contributes to that, particularly social media, in which people are able to actually live out their feeling of recognition or misrecognition by practicing it discursively over time. So this, I think, is part of the solidarity crisis that we're dealing with at the moment, and it's a significant problem for the crises of legitimacy and discourse that you mentioned a little bit ago. Um, to end on a slightly more positive note, I'll just note a couple things that we might think about as we think about a more positive kind of communication environment. So, how do we break out of this recognition crisis, as I've called it in writing? One is to look for grounds for solidarities that cut across these more narrow identities, broader solidarities. Climate has the potential to be one of those in that we're all directly affected by it. It's going to affect our food, not to mention the heat that we're going to deal with. Another interesting idea, I had it a little bit ago, but I heard Ben Shapiro talk about it on the Ezra Klein show a couple days ago. And that was the idea of gratitude. And this is not something we talk a lot about in social sciences or the social studies of social movements. But kind of the antithesis of grievance politics is gratitude, to recognize that despite serious problems that we have in our society and other societies have, there's a lot to be grateful for that we are in the particular time and place we're in, if you take a historical perspective. So, thinking a little bit along the lines of gratitude and how that might be incorporated into our communication, I think is interesting. Finally, I think the idea of depersonalizing our grievances is worthwhile. There's a lot of loss that has happened in the world, that's happening, that will happen with climate. But the politics of recognition tends to want to pin those losses on someone else, to find another group to blame and call them out, as the expression goes. But it's also worth noting, it may be worth seeing the progression of late modern society as something that's not personalized. It's processes that are larger than any individual or larger than even any particular group. But these processes kind of give out these losses among different groups. So I think that that might be another kind of way of building solidarity, recognizing that we're all in a larger trajectory of history that creates a lot of challenges that we all are going to face and perhaps might be able to face them a little bit better together.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. I have a million follow-up questions, but I'm going to hold them for a moment so we can get our other two panelists in. So, David, I'm going to turn to you. Um, Newspapers are in crisis. News outlets of all kinds are trying to figure out how to reach and keep their audiences. And I know you spent a good chunk of your career at the Globe, and now you're making feature documentaries. How do you think about fact-based storytelling right now at a moment when trusted institutions like the Globe or PBS don't serve the same legitimizing purpose they once did?
Well, the short answer to your question is I would say that they have never been more important. They are vital to a democratic society, and they are vital to what Chris was just talking about, which is moving forward together, where we all have a sense of shared facts, which is an increasing problem, and where we can all have a common understanding of the failings of our society, which is one of the things that we need to constantly probe and cast light on as journalists. I'll continue my answer, but let me just step back and say how grateful I am to be part of this new center and to be among some brilliant people. And Eric, I just want to say, I don't think you said enough at the top about who you are and all the amazing things that you have done and the leadership that you've brought to bear to bring this center from something that was for a couple of years seemingly a shifting PowerPoint presentation to something that is now actually bringing people together and putting money toward things that will hopefully give us a greater appreciation of all the challenges that we face and some of the issues that we hope to address through this new center. But to try to give a more expansive answer to your question, and I don't know if I could be quite as expansive as Chris Wells, but I'll try, is that we are living in a time where, as Chris said, we are all seeing the world through sort of a fragmented view. We have algorithms that serve us news and information that make it hard in some ways to have the shared facts that we might have traditionally had in decades past, when there was one newspaper that people might have turned to, or the network news, or some other more shared kind of information, where the media might have had more pretensions of focusing on the broader picture and the common good, and had sort of this intention of being more objective. Ultimately, we are reliant on journalists to produce stories that give us a deeper understanding of what's happening in the world, one not based on their opinions, but based on verifiable facts. And it is vital that journalists constantly look at what is true or false, check public officials when they make statements that might shade the truth or the reality, and give people, give their readers, viewers, and listeners a deeper sense of what is happening in the world, why it's happening, some context that is grounded in fact, and not get lost in the welter of opinion mongering that we are drowning in our siloed algorithmic feeds that tell us, essentially confirm our own view of the world. I just read this great quote by George Orwell. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. And if we don't have that, if journalists can't do that, then we do not have an independent, free press that is serving the public as it should.
Thanks, David. I want to go on to Amy, because I think that Amy's response might actually shed the kind of question that I have for you. So let me bring you in, Amy. So you've told stories on film about gay rights, about Judaism in America, and a range of other topics. It's a strategy of telling stories now about social and political issues different than it was, let's say, 20 years ago. And so can you talk about, if so, can you talk about what has changed in terms of storytelling and audience impact from your own experience?
Yes, thank you, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm incredibly excited to be a part of the MISI team. As I like to say, I'm a filmmaker by trade, not an environmental justice or environment science person at all. So I just am so thrilled and great and feel incredible gratitude to be a part of something as incredible as this team. So I would say yes and no. Storytelling has changed and it hasn't changed. So for me, the way that I tell stories is very much through the process of discovery. So I might read an article and discover that, this family is deciding, these two gay guys want to have a family and they're deciding how they're going to do that. And they have a wonderful friend who offers to be a surrogate for them. And that takes us on this kind of journey together. And so I go in with a very open mind. And when I think about sort of, not putting like the journalistic idea, I'm not putting my own perspective in, I'm just letting the story unfold. And of course, at a certain point, I might ask questions or I might make editing choices that would guide the story in a certain way. But I will say that typically when I start a project and when I end a project, I end in a very different place than I began. So for me, that part of the storytelling doesn't change. But the formats that we now have, the access to those formats, it's never been, less expensive to create podcasts. Anybody can have a digital recording device and a microphone and, put together some kind of storytelling podcast that reaches a lot of people. Anybody can get access to an iPhone and create a movie or a TikTok campaign or, an advertisement even. So the sort of modes of expression, the technology is ever changing and is going to continue to change. But I think that the basis of great stories doesn't change. Yeah, does that make sense? And then I think your second question speaks to the impact piece. Can you repeat better?
Yeah, I mean, how do you
Okay.
think about the impact that your work, especially when you're doing documentary work, is going to have on audiences? Do you think about audiences differently than you used to? And if so, how do you change the way that you tell stories to be responsive to those audiences?
Yeah, so what I'm thinking about what Chris was saying about kind of the fragmentation and the sort of niche idea, right? Everybody's kind of in their silos. And so one of the things that I will say has changed about filmmaking, particularly long format filmmaking, is you really need to think about the audience when you're making the work. It's not, and this is the way I've always made films, but this is not the way that everybody necessarily does it. So in other words, when I'm thinking of an idea, I might be pitching that idea to various stakeholders early on. I might be sharing scripts early on in the process. I might be having test screenings with audiences across the making of the project. So I'm engaging audiences across the process. And I think that this affords us the ability to connect with what I call community of interest. So we're building our community, people who aren't necessarily demographically similar, but they may have interests that are the same, right? And so I'm building that along the way. And I think that a lot of filmmakers are realizing these days that if you want to get your work done, whether you want to fundraise for it or get it out in the world, these traditional methods, the funding is being cut left and right. Budgets, from public television to corporate entities, they're acquiring less and less work. And so we really have to think about how can we directly connect with our audiences? What is the best way to do that? And how do we do that across the span of a project? And I find that very exciting because I feel like that communication creates a dialogue that informs my filmmaking. And sometimes makes me think of things, questions or issues that I wouldn't, because of my own biases, right? I wouldn't have even have considered. So I I I feel like that is sort of the only way going forward is to figure out, how to create that social impact throughout the process of thinking and connect with your audience throughout the process. David
Go
has a
ahead,
question.
David. Yeah.
I just want to emphasize and expand on what Amy was just saying about her process, which I think is vital to any work of journalism, and I include a lot of what Amy does as journalism, as documentary filmmaking, and it is starting a story with questions and not answers, and it's not knowing necessarily where your project is going to lead, what the ultimate story that you're going to tell, and being open-minded enough throughout the process of acquiring facts and figuring out how to shape a story so it's most compelling and packs the greatest punch. It is trying to assemble enough information through questions and letting the facts sort of help letting the fact chart the course of how you tell the story properly.
So David, I want to build on that and try to connect or put into some tension maybe what you said earlier and then what Amy was saying, and I hope this comes back to what Chris is saying as well. But David, as I understood, your answer, you said you started by saying institutions like the Globe and PBS and NPR, they're more important now than they've ever been. Let's just say news outlets, whether from trusted news outlets, let's just say that, more important now than they've ever been. These are institutions with editorial power. Often when people confront the information, or let's say in the past, it was more likely that people would go directly to that news source. They would trust the editorial voice of that institution, and therefore the information within that was to be trusted because of the power of the editorial voice of the institution. What I'm sensing now, though, is that there's a tension between what Amy is saying, which is everyone now has the ability to tell stories. We could be more creative in how we tell stories. We can cultivate our own networks through the channels that we all have access to. We don't need to rely on these editorial gatekeepers anymore. But David, you're pointing to a crisis when we don't rely on those editorial gatekeepers. So help me square that circle.
I don't think I said what you think I said. Just to be clear,
Great.
What I actually meant to say is that fact-based reporting is more important now, perhaps, than it ever has been. And I'm not saying that has to come from traditional long-standing media. It doesn't have to come from the Boston Globe or the New York Times or NPR. We do see all kinds of manifestations of great reporting that comes from new kinds of media. And I'm thinking of all kinds of nonprofit, non-traditional media like ProPublica that have emerged in recent years that are providing a great deal of deep, investigative, fact-based reporting. One that goes and gets the documents, backs up assertions with verifiable fact, not just spouting a commentary or opinion. And I certainly think there's a place for that. And in a healthy democratic society, it's great that we have free-flowing opinions. But to keep the commonweal going, to keep our body politic informed, to all be reading from not siloed feeds that are serving us algorithms of all the kind of stuff that confirms our own biases. We need truth tellers, and that means people who are looking, who start with questions and not answers, and look for facts, and that can come from anywhere. And there's so many outlets that I have read in recent years that have popped up. I'm thinking of heat map, which is doing a lot of great, rigorous climate reporting that really helps cast light on what is happening in our public institutions. That all said, I'm not trying to undercut the importance of the traditional media. We are lucky to have institutions like the New York Times that can absorb a $15 billion lawsuit that was just waged against it by the President of the United States. And unfortunately, nonprofit news sources don't necessarily have the wherewithal to stand up to major lawsuits when there are deep pockets that can throw lots of lawyers and make life miserable for upstart publications. That is intimidation, and that is a means of shutting down freedom of speech in a lot of ways. And we've seen that in places like Hungary and Turkey and Russia and many other countries, Venezuela. It leads to the eradication of free speech and a free press. And so having these bulwarks of traditional media remain vital. And the New York Times has done amazing reporting. The Washington Post has done amazing reporting on so many levels over the recent years, just as the Boston Globe has. And it doesn't mean that these institutions don't have their own shortcomings or their own failures. But what separates, in my mind, reputable media from other sources is those that rely on, as I've said repeatedly, verifiable facts, and then correct the record when they make mistakes, because we make mistakes. We are not supreme perfect beings, but we do our best to avoid them as much as possible. We do our best to be fair-minded, and that means trying to seek as many different credible points of view as possible. We don't necessarily engage in both sidesism. We don't just spout stuff that people say that is meaningless. We're not seeking false balance. I think of what Marty Baron, the former editor-in-chief of the Boston Globe and the Washington Post, used to say, and I'll read something that I share with my students. The goal of journalists should be to have our work be as scientific as we could make it. Our research should be guided, should be conscientious and careful. We should be guided by what the evidence shows. That means we have to be generous listeners and eager learners, especially conscious of our own suppositions, prejudices, pre-existing opinions, and limited knowledge. We don't, as I said, and I must be echoing Marty Baron, we don't start with the answers, we go seeking them. First, with the already formidable challenge of asking the right questions, and finally, with the arduous task of verification.
Thanks, David, and thank you for the clarification to my earlier point. And on that, I want to bring you in, Chris, and I want to ask you about, I actually want to ask you about the role of institutions and what role they play in this recognition crisis that you're describing.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, ultimately, the institutions, certainly, if they're to be trusted, need to be manifestations of some type of public movement, some type of public action. Sort of the definition of an institution is social practices that are somehow repeated, so that there's some kind of process or mechanism by which they can be repeated according to a set of rules. So institutions are extremely important in recognition processes because these repeated social practices can generate recognition or misrecognition. So the way that they do that and the way that they interact with different publics is really important. In the case of news media, we've seen this, and news media are certainly not perfect. In our current moment with their rapid decline, we're certainly missing them, and we're going to miss them as well. But the record of, local news isn't perfect on issues of treating groups fairly or equally. It's mixed, and that's because I would say that the job of a journalist is super difficult. And David alluded to some of those issues with getting the record right and correcting it when we don't have it right. But that is to say that institutions can be contributors to a recognition environment that isn't equal or fair to all of the groups in society.
I just want to touch on, and this is my last question to all of you, but I want to touch on this question of polarization. And, we've talked about, we're in an environment now where, when you, David, for example, when you talk about the New York Times and the Washington Post, a good chunk of of the population of the country will say, well, I don't trust them, right? They're not trustworthy. And so how should we handle this, where we clearly have a proliferation of news institutions and other institutions across the ideological spectrum, each of which claims to have some claim to truth, right? And so how do we negotiate this splintering of our institutional landscape, while we're also committing to fact-based question, sort of question beginning fact-based storytelling?
Is that a question for me?
It's a question for all of you, but you could go ahead and start, David.
Um, to be honest, if I knew the answer to that question, I think I would be a wealthy man. It's obviously a major challenge in a fragmented world, especially a fragmented world where social media and increasingly AI is exacerbating that fragmentation and exacerbating the sense of that certain publications are inherently either fraudulent or biased in some fashion. So there is a lot of propaganda to run against, and there is uh, um, the world of appification, in essence, where we're constantly reading things from separate sources. But fundamentally, I think it's incumbent on any serious news organization to uh, be as transparent as possible about their methods, and be as fair-minded as possible in their reporting. That means that when you write something critical about someone, you solicit their response, and you get and you fairly and thoughtfully try to articulate different points of view, and you try to ground any assertions in fact, and you don't just report what one person says and another person says, but you actually try to say, but this is what we know, this is what we can say, is the evidence. And that is, I think, fundamentally the best way. And then repeating that, doing that as often as possible, and giving people the opportunity to comment and respond to stories, which has democratized for the good and the bad. And when I write a story in the Boston Globe, sorry for my French, but there's a lot of bullshit commentary that is beneath this story, but it is good that people have the opportunity to respond, and that democratizes the any publication, I think.
Amy or Chris, did you want to chime in?
I mean, we're part of an institution here at BU. It's not a media institution, but it's where I think about is it starts small And it starts for me in my classroom, creating a space where people feel comfortable to express in debate and discuss, and not feel shut down for having an idea or reflection that could be construed as controversial. So really thinking about like how do we get the next generation to do what David is saying, which is like understand what facts are, make a case, do the research, make your argument, which may completely counter somebody else's argument, but how do we create spaces where we allow for that to happen, so that there's not a sense of, if I don't toe the party line, I'm going to be ostracized from this classroom, or I'm going to be outside of the kind of culture of the institution. So even if I disagree with what they have to say, I champion that kind of stuff in my classes, and I think that's really important at every level of society. I don't have, like David's saying, it's a really challenging question. I just try to do it in the small ways that I have the ability, where I can make the tiniest bit of change.
I can build off that kind of directly. I think there's two issues that I would think about. First of all, this is a super challenging situation because we're quite a ways down the road of polarization, as Eric pointed out. Although a couple of our colleagues wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Other Divide. And their point there was, we talk a lot about the left-right divide, red and blue, but the divide between people who participate in politics a lot and those who are pretty tuned out is at least as big. And those on left and right are in some ways much more similar to each other than they are to those who are mostly not tuned out. It's about 45% of the country that doesn't vote in most elections. So I think that it's helpful to keep those people in mind. Keep in mind that there is a group that aren't necessarily apolitical, but their beliefs are at least mixed enough, or non-existent enough that they're not completely polarized, like these other folks. Another point would be the political economy of the system. David's referred to that, that the algorithms are a big issue. Really underlying that is the advertising-based model of all of these institutions, and the fact that we as a society have generally allowed that. There have been proposals to change that, for example, to impose taxes on super targeted advertising, or the use of algorithms to drastically filter the content that people are seeing, that might cut down on that, and then the money could go to something like nonprofit news that would help to counter the issue a little bit. So I think there are a couple of ways of thinking about that content. And then the last thing I would say is, in terms of the story making, when news organizations are making their stories, I think it's worth thinking about the fact that audiences are multidimensional. We tend to think of them in terms of their partisan dispositions, but every individual who's reading that paper may have a partisan idea, but they also have a whole bunch of other things. They have their interests, their gender, their ethnicity, things that they're worried about, children or not, those kinds of things. People are multidimensional. I think it's important that stories, right along the lines of what Amy was talking about earlier, that stories display that stories display some complexity, getting away from the horse race, which tends to paint us in red and blue colors, and instead telling deeper stories about ways in which people are connecting, sometimes in unusual ways, can be really valuable.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat that I want to turn to now. This is from Doug, and I'll just read it. And it's directed towards you, Chris, but I think others can chime in. He says, I like the notion of recognition. I think that's important, but perhaps as a function of our tribal nature, question mark. We want to be recognized within our tribe. But I haven't heard and wonder about, how does the corporatization of news and information shape our view of fact? Rather than Murrow, or rather shaping the news menu, the corporate ownership seems to Bezos and Washington Post, Paramount and CBS. Any thoughts about that?
Well, David, I'll tackle the first part if you grab the second part. So the tribalism and recognition, yeah, I think that's exactly correct. I think that our tendency to seek out recognition has directly to do with, the evolutionary biologists are looking at this, thinking about the kinds of social groups that humans evolved among. and the importance of developing social skills for humans in those early social groups. The fact that we're so much more than other mammals like us, so much more dependent on cooperation, so much more dependent on coalitions of other humans being involved. So I think the tribalism is a significant aspect of it. We want to be esteemed within our tribe. We want to distinguish ourselves to some degree from other tribes. But the thing that I would also observe is we live in a country of 300 some million people. We can't all be in tribes of 200 people. And we have the capacity to have these multiple identities. We can have a smaller, closer to home identity and also a larger identity that we share with others and feel affiliation with a much bigger group. And I think in the most healthy moments in history, it's been when societies enabled people to have both of those things that were able to sit next to each other peaceably. And we desperately need to get back to something more like that.
David, do you want to take the other part of that question? You're muted.
I was just thinking of what Chris was saying about larger tribes, and I just was thinking in Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. He has these, I forget what the name of these communities are, but it's a way of sort of shedding the traditional tribal identification, and we sort of come together. I wonder if anyone can put in the chat. I was just trying to Google it, but it's sort of a beautiful idea about how people can come together through different ways, not through their race, not through their through other sort of more traditional identities, but come together in through shared interests and shared. Thank you. I don't know how to pronounce that without it sounding crass. um, but to move on to some of the questions about the impact of our the billionaire owners on the media. Um, I think that until recently, we have been sort of fortunate that this model hasn't had the pernicious effects that many feared that it might. And in some ways, these very wealthy owners of some of our most significant publications have provided running room for their news organizations and sheltered them from threats. And that is still the case to some extent. Of course, what's happening at the Washington Post is an asterisk to that. But Marty Baron in his book most recently that I was quoting from that I have on my bookshelf here, Collision of Power, he does talk about how he never in his time, at least at the Washington Post, felt any pressure from Jeff Bezos to write in any way, shape, or form, and the publication was left to its own editorial standards, and that was a good thing. That, of course, is not necessarily the case now. Their editorial page has been completely revamped. A lot of traditional voices that have been at the Post for many years, both on the editorial and the reporting side, have left because their editorial standards in some cases have changed, and that is deeply concerning. But I would say that at the Boston Globe, we have had I would say a benign billionaire enabling us to emerge from massive financial losses to build our business model and now be able to be able to report without fear or favor. And the Globe has done a lot of amazing work in recent years. And I should say, in my time at the Globe, I never felt any sort of sense that that there was a hand on the lever. I can think of, like, for example, a story I wrote about the impact of private jets on the climate and efforts to reduce aviation emissions. And I noted that our billionaire owner had his own private jet, and nobody. And that did not stop that story from getting on the front page of the newspaper. And I think another example of that is the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal published over the summer this story about how the president of the United States allegedly sent a arguably lewd note to Jeffrey Epstein, and the president has sued Rupert Murdoch and the Wall Street Journal for billions of dollars, but he did not prevent that story from becoming front page news, and that's to his credit.
And maybe to your earlier point about just having the economic cushion to subsume something like that, right?
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
And you know, that is a benefit of having deep pocketed owners, that there's some insulation from threats, which are very pernicious and have shuttered institutions, journalistic institutions all over the world. And it's a means, it's often a tactic of authoritarian governments to threaten, sue, and dismantle publications in that fashion.
So we have another interesting related question in the chat, and I'll just summarize it. I mean, essentially, this is from Michael, who's asking about the non-advertising subscriber profit model. How is it shaping reporting and editorial considerations at legacy publications? And so I think that's the gist of the question, is that we're moving towards a non-advertising model. Does that predict some changes in what we're actually going to see from reporting?
So I think, as somebody who studies the media, I think that's a super interesting question, but I don't know the answer, or I don't know of studies that have looked at it yet. But it's super relevant because we have studied for a long time various kinds of impacts of advertising as the subscription model. And David referred earlier, in the 20th century, a lot of the journalism was buffered by having very wealthy owners, as well as high profit margins that came from advertising by department stores and stuff that really buffered the journalism. So I'll be curious to hear what he knows or thinks about subscribers having some kind of influence.
And classified ads, which was the main source of revenue for at least newspapers. But just to that question, these publications that were mentioned in that question all continue to have advertising, and advertising remains a substantial portion of the revenue of the Globe and the Washington Post and the New York Times. It is one of the primary reasons probably there remains print publications, you know, the paper and ink, because they still generate more revenue than digital ads do. So even though we have subscriber models, this is a new means of us trying to, not new anymore, but relatively new way of us, at least online, trying to generate greater revenue streams. And clearly in some, this has been a major source of revenue for the New York Times, which now has its by far largest readership ever, based on all of the online subscriptions, as well as the Wall Street Journal, and until the chaos at the Washington Post starting last year. They have also, you know, have had tremendous success. And also smaller publications, regional publications like the Boston Globe, have seen a growing and loyal online subscription basis. And the hope, I think, ultimately is that we do not have to rely on the the waxing and waning of advertising revenue, which can, contract during recessions, and also, if a major advertiser isn't happy with the story, that has also traditionally been a source of concern and influence on what publications might cover. The hope is that this will continue to provide a substantial and stable source of revenue. And certainly at the publications I have mentioned, this has been a benefit, but it is not universally applicable. And there are too many news organizations that just have not been able to bring in a large enough subscriber base to keep them flush.
Thank you, David. Go ahead, Amy.
I had a question, but it may be too late to ask this, but I'm just curious because I have this panel here and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. I have a colleague, this kind of speaks to the tribalization piece that we were talking about earlier. I have a colleague who attended a conference this summer. It was an entertainment related conference in LA. And one of the things that the industry was talking about was sort of the future of AI's ability to project whoever it is that's watching, whatever it is you're watching, into the actual entertainment story. So if I'm watching, a film about, I don't know, a guy who's having trouble with his mother, I can change it to myself having trouble with their mother and, talk about niche kind of perspective. I feel like this is where, the technology is bringing us, which on one level, I feel incredibly inspired by the technology because it democratizes the medium. But on another hand, there are all these impacts that I feel like it's going so fast that we can't process. So I don't know, Eric, if there's time for this to parse this, but I think
Amy, no, there's not time, but here's what I will say. Fascinating question. And I will also say that I feel like it's a question that is at the core of what we're doing with MISI, with the center. And one of the questions I was going to ask you that we also don't have time, so I'm just going to kind of leave it. I'm going to leave it with this. I'm going to say that, the goal of our center is to experiment and to understand where all this technology is taking us so that we can build these bridges, so that we can address this misrecognition crisis, so that we can address polarization in some way through thoughtful consideration of some of this technology. We're not going to take it as a foregone conclusion. We're going to take it as an opportunity to ask deep questions about where this is going and how we might be able to see the kind of social impact, meaning that bridge building social impact that we're talking about, how we might actually be able to achieve that through our position here at the university, where we're able to convene, to think deeply, to foster new ideas, and to understand what happens when those ideas get sent in the world. So I want to leave that question there as a sort of an invitation to everyone to stay engaged with us, with the center. We just shared in the chat our launch event, which is happening on November 7th. On the theme of communicating climate, where we will be digging deep into these questions for an entire day with policymakers and academics and technologists and journalists and artists who are committed to understanding how to tell stories in a deeply polarized and fraught context that we're in now about climate and the environment. And with that, I want to thank David and Chris and Amy for your incredible participation today. And thank you, everyone, for listening to us for the last hour. It's been a pleasure.